who the Gauls were. Say Gauls, and a handful of powerful images rush in at once. Hilltop ramparts clenched against the sky, warriors with oval shields and long, springy swords, torcs flashing at the throat, a priestly figure druid, bard, lawgiver speaking in a sacred grove where springs rise cold from limestone. Those images are not wrong, but they are incomplete. Gauls is a convenient word that ancient writers used for a wide mosaic of Celtic-speaking peoples, who, between the 5th and 1st centuries BCE, filled most of what is now France and Belgium, reached into Switzerland and the Netherlands, and projected power across the Alps into northern Italy. Like any shorthand, it blurs as much as it clarifies. This opening part aims to make the picture sharp again, to define who the Gauls were and were not, to place them in their landscape and time, to weigh what we can know from things in the ground and words on ancient pages, and to sketch the themes we will follow through the rise of Latin craftsmen and war leaders, the shock of Roman conquest, and the long afterlife of Gaul in the Roman world and in modern memory. First, names. Ancient Greeks wrote about Keltoi and Galatai, Romans about Celtai and Galli. These labels rarely match cleanly. Celts is the broad family term, pointing to related languages and styles that stretched from Iberia to the Danube, and by the 3rd century BCE into Anatolia, the Galatians. Gauls, more specifically, are those Celtic-speaking peoples of Transalpine Gaul, the lands north of the Alps and west of the Rhine, who shared the Latin repertoire of metalwork and warcraft, and who, by Caesar's time, organized themselves into dozens of civic communities and leagues. Not every Celt is a Gaul, and not every trait that Romans called Gallic was exclusive to Gaul, but the overlap is large enough that the name can be useful if we remember the diversity it hides. Second, ground. The Gaulish world is less a rectangle on a map than a web of corridors. West and north lie the Atlantic and Channel coasts, with estuaries, salt pans, and fish-rich shallows. South runs the Rhone-Saône axis to the Mediterranean. East, the Rhine and Moselle thread toward the Germanic lands and the Middle Danube. Between them stand uplands, Armorica, the Massif Central, the Jura, and broad river plains. Waterways are the true roads. Amphorae of wine float upriver, blocks of salt, bars of iron, coils of bronze, and cloth bales flow down. Against this geography, the hilltop town, the oppida makes sense, a terrace commanding routes, with room for workshops and markets under timber and rubble walls. The landscape does not divide war from work. It asks for both: engineering to tame slopes and streams, courage to defend crossings and fairs. Third, time. Our story opens in the Hallstatt world, early Iron Age, then pivots to Latin named, after a lakeside site in Switzerland, where a new style of metal and wood came out of the water. Sinuous vegetal scrolls, clever fittings, long cutting blades, fine scabbards, fittings for harness and chariotry, elegant brooches, and the proud circle of the torque. This is not a single invention moment, but a series of refinements and fashions that spread rapidly along the trade routes, hitching rides with traveling artisans, warriors in foreign service, merchants, and marriage ties. By the 5th-4th centuries BCE, the Latin kit and its vocabulary of forms mark a wide space that Greek and Roman observers will call Gaul. In that space, change is constant. New elites rise, forts and their hinterlands grow, coinage appears, alliances thicken and thin. Roman influence first trickles, then pours in. And, at last, legions do what wine and amphorae began. Fourth, sources and how to read them. On one hand, archaeology stratified ramparts, timber-laced walls of the Murus Gallicus, storage pits, smithies with slag and tuyères, furnaces and molds, gold and bronze hoards, cemeteries with chariots and mail, sacred enclosures with offerings thrown into water, workshops with miscast brooches and half-finished torcs. These are precise and stubborn witnesses. They tell us what people could make, fix, and carry, how they stored food, what they repaired first after a fire, what metals they could smelt, and how far they traded. On the other hand, Greek and Roman authors, Polybius, Posidonius, Caesar, Livy, Strabo, offer scenes of banquets and councils, of sudden charges and theatrical boasts, of Druids who do not write their doctrine, of markets humming under the eye of a chieftain. They add color and words, but they also bring their lens, Roman fears, Greek tastes, political agendas. The only safe way to use them is to let earth and text argue, then accept the points where their stories meet. A rampart that matches a description, a river battle that lines up with amphora dumps, a law by oath that fits the pattern of hostages, seals, and offerings. Fifth, myths, old and new, that we will avoid. The Gauls were neither the cartoon of perpetual rage, nor a noble savage fantasy of forest mystics. They built on a large scale. They measured and counted. They cleared, plowed, sowed, harvested, stored, taxed, and traded. They made objects whose finish still surprises metal workers. They could plan a campaign and a siege. They agreed on rules and used hostages and oaths to hold them. They sang and memorized, not because writing was unknown, but because certain kinds of knowledge were meant to live in people rather than on tablets. At the same time, they were not a centralized nation. Their world is a tessellation of peoples, Aedui, Arverni, Sequani, Helvetii, Remi, Bituriges, Parisi, Veneti, and many more, each with its territory, allies, rivalries, coin types, and pride. In good years, they formed leagues. In crises, they fought over precedence. When Roman power pressed in, some courted it, some resisted, many hedged. The very strength that Romans later called fierce independence was also a coordination problem, one that Caesar learned to exploit. Sixth, an outline of the journey ahead. We will follow a double path, the things path, what hands made and moved, and the words and rituals path, what mouths said and minds believed. We begin with the Hallstatt to Latin transition and the spread of oppida as workshops, markets, fortresses, the skeletal system of Gaul. We will watch social order take shape, aristocrats and their retinues, free farmers and craft families, dependent households, clientage ladders, assemblies that make law by oath and gift, the hostage logic that secures pacts, and the practice of exchange that makes coinage worthwhile. We will enter sacred places, groves and springs and timber enclosures, through archaeology and cautious readings of ancient remarks, and meet the Druids, bards, and ovates as keepers of time, law, and speech. We will walk the wall of Amurus Gallicus, learn why its lattice holds, and why the long Latin sword is shaped as it is, then descend from ramparts into river valleys and sea inlets to watch wine arrive and salt go out, and see how Greek Massalia, Marseille, acted as a hinge between Gaul and the Mediterranean. Then we will pass into the age of direct Roman pressure, where old corridors harden into roads and colonies, where Caesar brings a new grammar of war-deep marches, earthworks that bite the landscape, bridges thrown across fast water, and where Gaul answers with scorched earth, ambush, and, in Vercingetorix, a leader who tries to solve the coordination problem at last. We finish with Roman Gaul civitates and their councils, Roman law and Latin speech, villas and potteries, a city network knitting old hill fort hinterlands into new grids, and with the stubborn survival of names, rites, and place memory under Roman plaster. Seventh, a note on tone and fairness. Whenever possible, we will choose the ordinary over the sensational. How a community builds and keeps a wall is often a better teacher than one day's charge into spears. How a market counts salt and grain tells more about a people's capacity than a single diplomat's speech. Blood is in the story war, and sacrifice are there. But we will handle both without relish or apology, and always set them inside a system of work, oath, and season. Where the sources argue, we will say so. Where they fall silent, we will lean on the ground. Where both are hazy, we will mark the limits of what can be said. The Gauls deserve that care. It is too easy to let their story be told only by the men who conquered them, or by the modern legends that needed heroes or foils. Eighth, the living places where Gaul can still be seen. You do not need to imagine only from texts. Across France and its neighbors, rampart lines still run under beech and oak. Ditches show in aerial photos as ghost curves in wheat. Rivers still carry the logic of amphora traffic. Museum cases hold torcs that could clasp a throat today, brooches whose pins still spring. Sections of Murus Gallicus reveal the carpentry thinking behind stone. Coin hoards map political weather like isobars. Modern roads follow Roman roads that followed Gaulish paths over even older routes. The landscape is a palimpsest. Each layer preserves enough of the last to make reading possible. Ninth, a brief answer to what made the Gauls rise. Part of it is geography used well, anchoring to nodes where trade and harvest can be protected and taxed, combining hill, water, and timber into defensible production sites, linking hinterlands to harbors with reliable roads. Part of it is craft. Metal workers who can draw wire fine and weld links sound, smiths who balance blade weight to human reach, potters and weavers who supply sturdy everyday goods at scale, salt boilers who free a region from dependence on fresh meat or sun alone. Part of it is social engineering, clientage that binds bold young men to leaders, councils that can make law stick without written codes, song that carries norms across winters, a ritual calendar that turns generosity and oath into public events. These are not exotic traits. They are the ordinary scaffolds of any large society. But in Gaul, they took a recognizable form, the Latin form, that makes a coherent story from Atlantic to Alps. 10th, a fair preview of the end. The Roman conquest did not erase Gaul with a wave of iron. It exploited fault lines and taught new ones into existence. It severed some corridors and opened others. It replaced many councils and left others in place under new names. It pulled elites into a larger ladder of honors, while taxing fields and men more predictably. It broke some sanctuaries and legalized some gods under Roman titles. What fell quickly were the political freedoms that rested on being able to break alliance and make war on one's own schedule. What survived, because they were useful, were many of the crafts, field systems, road habits, urban cores, and place names. Gaul as a sovereign space ends under Caesar and his successors. Gaul as a lived landscape persists, translated. Finally, why this story is worth your time. Partly because it belongs to the deep past of modern France and its neighbors. Partly because it shows how a society that seems dramatic from a distance is, up close, a chain of practical choices about water, wood, iron, grain, oath, and pride. The Gauls teach us to look past the first row of the parade-painted bodies and soaring boasts to the workshops and store pits, the chancels of sacred enclosures, the counters at river markets, the benches of councils, the joints of timber within stone. If we keep this double vision spectacle and scaffolding each scene that follows, will make more sense. The arc of expansion, the chemistry of alliance, the logic of the Roman advance, the stubbornness of memory. And the figures who stride through the later parts, craftsmen at their anvils, elders with their seals, druids speaking in measured phrases, merchants tallying salt and wine, Vercingetorix riding between fires, Caesar dictating by lamplight, while engineers cut a ditch will feel less like myths and more like people moving through a world that, in its textures, is closer to ours than legend suggests. Cone. Origins and spread. From Hallstatt to Latin. Before the Gauls of Caesar's pages, there was an older iron world we call Hallstatt, a belt of chiefdoms from the Alps into the Danube lands, whose wealth rode on salt, iron, and patronage. Out of that belt, beginning in the 5th century BCE, a new style and toolkit took shape around the Swiss lakes and along the Middle Rhine and Danube. Archaeologists named it after one place, Latin, where a winter-low shoreline exposed timbers, spearheads, swords, scabbards, brooches, and fittings by the hundreds. The name stuck, and with it, the recognition that we are seeing less a single invention than a rapid reconfiguration. A new grammar of metal and wood, a taste for sinuous vegetal scrolls and S-curves, a rebalanced long sword that favors cut and reach, delicate wirework, and sheet bronze repoussé in jewelry, and clever iron fittings for harness and vehicles. Style is never just decoration. Here, it signals a new way of assembling power through craft that travels, leaders who can stage feasts on a bigger scale, and fortified centers that command roots. The change starts in workshops. Hallstatt smiths had already mastered bloomery iron. Latin smiths pushed control further. Tighter carbon windows, cleaner welds, longer, livelier blades. Scabbards with metal throats and chaps tailored to draw without snag. Lance and javelin heads tuned to break or stick as intended. Bronze workers drew wire as fine as hair, twisted it into torcs, whose terminals, trumpet, buffer, or animal reed like signatures. Hammered sheet into helmet crests and cups. Cast brooches, fibulae, with spring systems that made pin and bow a single, resilient unit. Leather cutters and wheelwrights refined harness and vehicles. Glass workers pulled rods and dropped colored inlays. Potters shifted profiles and surface finish toward thin-walled vessels that could be stacked and traded in bulk. In short, a platform of skills appeared that made it possible to supply large populations with reliable gear and to signal status with finesse. Where craft concentrates, towns follow. The Latin Hilltop. Town, the oppidum, is best understood not as a castle, but as a multi-use terrace, inner and outer enclosures, street grids and packed earth, zones for smithing and casting with tidy piles of slag and miscasts, rows of granaries on posts, yards with loom weights and spindle whirls, yards with quernstones and troughs, markets that ran on fair days when traffic swelled, a sacred precinct, often timber-fenced, where offerings were buried or thrown into pits. Around the crown spread a suburban belt of farms, allotments, and trackways that stitched the hill to river landings. If Hallstatt noble seats read as hill farms with graves of astonishing richness, Latin oppida look like work cities, places where tens of acres of coordinated labor made a chief's promises credible. Roots decide what a hill can do. Gauls corridors, Atlantic estuaries, and salt pans in the west. The Loire-Seignon ladder to the Saône and Rhône. The Garonne to the Bay of Biscay. The Moselle-Meuse-Rhine comb eastward, gave Latin workshops, a reach Hallstatt never had. From Massalia, Marseille, Greek wine and decorated cups pressed inward by the amphora full. Northbound came salt, hides, slaves, metals, woolens, and grain. The proof lies in dumps of broken amphorae far from the sea, and in the wine services, found in elite graves, Greek or Etruscan craters, and cups paired with locally forged ladles, spits, and knives. Not far behind the amphorae came weights, measures, and the idea of coin. By the 3rd–2nd centuries BCE, elite centers were issuing their own coinage, first aping Greek types and legends, then abstracting heads and horses into confident, spiraling lines. Coin did not replace barter wholesale. It gave leaders a way to crystallize dues, pay retinues, and make long-distance deals feel less like favors and more like contracts. Movement spreads style as surely as trade. We can watch Latin forms ride with migrants and mercenaries through 3 main arcs. Southward, groups pressed along the Rhone into the Po plain, founding new seats in what Romans would call Cisalpine Gaul. There, Latin swords, brooches, and torcs sit beside Italic goods, and walls mix timber and rubble Gaulish logic with Italic orthogonal plans. Eastward, down the Danube, war bands and families peeled off into the Carpathian Basin and beyond. One stream remembered as the Galatians crossed into Anatolia and left their name there. Westward, across the Channel, shared styles and goods bound Armorica and southern Britain. The same curving art on metal, the same brooch types, the same habit of burying feasting gear in company with war gear, the same flows of wine and salt. None of this is a single people on the march. It is mobility of artisans looking for patrons, of young men looking for pay, of kin groups splitting and reforming, of chiefs marrying across water and pass. Beneath movement sits land and food. Latin farms are not poor. Field systems expand, ard marks, and later, deeper plow marks score light soils. Iron shares and coulters appear in numbers. Rotary querns replace older grinding. Storage shifts from dispersed pits to more stable granaries on posts. Cattle and sheep herds grow. Horse breeding improves, not least to feed the appetite for retinues that ride or drive. Salt-boiling sites multiply along marshes and brine springs, freeing meat from proximity to pasture and making salted fish and pork long-distance goods. These are not the footnotes of a romantic age. They are the calories that let a council sit, a garrison hold, a festival feast, a road crew dig, a druid train students for years. Religion changes shape, not essence. Hallstatt barrows give way to Latin sanctuaries, fenced rectangles, where offerings accumulate, and where, at times, trophies are displayed, weapons bent, and armor spiked to make them safe for the gods. Springs and groves, the perennial holy places, keep their pull, but the new hilltop centers tend to pull sacred space inside their orbit. That does not secularize the world. It integrates oath, feast, and arbitration into the same weekend of effort. A leader who can feed and judge in the shadow of a grove and rampart holds more than a sword can. Contacts with the Mediterranean thicken and complicate. Massalia is more than a wine pump. It is a school in measures and contracts, a broker of mercenaries, a relay of news. Etruscan and Italic traders bring not only goods, but models of civic finesse. Paved surfaces, regular plots, written tallies, the prestige of the stone-finished facade. Some Gaulish centers sniff and adapt, laying out straighter streets, enclosing with more geometrical confidence, experimenting with stone revetments on timber cores. Others stick to timber logic and invest instead in volume-longer walls, larger store zones, bigger fairgrounds. The choices are visible in the ground, and they are political. How much of foreign habit to import? How to translate it into local authority? What of names and peoples? By the time we can name them, regional blocks are already clear. Aedui and Sequani on the Sound Dube, Arverni and Bituriges in the center. Remi and Belgae to the northeast, Helveti at the Alpine foreland, Veneti along the Armorican seas, Santoni, Pictones, Parisi, Senones, and scores more. Each block fuses a cluster of smaller groups. Each has elders and kings, client ladders, and external allies. Each coins or trades coin. Each guards roads that belong to all when peace holds, and to none when it breaks. The mosaic is stable in habit, and fast in motion confederations assemble and dissolve with remarkable speed. This agility is a strength in local competition and a weakness against a patient neighbor with a single command voice. The wall says much about that neighbor's future problem. The Latin Murus Gallicus a timber lattice keyed back into the rampart and faced with stone, pinned by thousands of long iron spikes, behaves differently from a pure stone wall. It flexes under shock. It resists rams by distributing force. It eats time and iron to build, but offers astonishing strength for the weight. Where ditch and bank are added with thoughtful geometry, an oppidum becomes a siege eater. It can be starved, but not easily battered flat. When, a century later, Roman engineers meet these walls, they will answer with circumvallation circles of trench and rampart that turn a single hill into a long belt of work. The duel of timbers and shovels begins here, in the choice to bind wood into stone, rather than stack stone alone. Coin closes this chapter where it began, with craft translating into order. As Latin centers learn to strike precious metal in quantity and to control weight, they teach themselves to count in a new way. Coin bears a head and a horse or a boar. It bears, soon enough, abbreviated names. It standardizes dues and sorting at fairs. It moves along with salt and wine and cloth. It returns in pay and gift. In the hands of a druid or chief, a string of coins is not only wealth, it is a portable promise proof that tomorrow's feast and levy have been planned. In that sense, the origin story of the Gauls is a story of counting and tying hill to river, tying craft to protection, tying oath to feast, tying many small centers into regions that can speak as one for a season. It is a remarkable assembly. Its very flexibility, though, is what later lets Rome pry it apart by buying here, threatening there, and forcing choices faster than councils prefer to make them. We will carry this frame into the next part, where we stop in the oppidum long enough to watch people at work, iron in the forge, salt on the boil, cloth on the loom, grain into pits, and out again, coin on the counter, oath on the lips. Only then will the later scenes, druids and law, feasts and trophies, chariot skirmishes and ambushes in alder swamps, feel like acts in a life that makes economic sense. Through society and economy, tribe, elite, and work. If you want to understand Gaul, do not begin with the war shout. Begin with a granary on posts, with a smith's trench and a pile of slag, with a yard full of loom-weight shadows, with a council bench polished by elbows. The society that Romans called Gallic was not a single pyramid of power, but a mesh of households and client ladders clustered under aristocratic houses, and gathered, when needed, into leagues. Its economy was not a scatter of self-sufficient farms, but a set of interlocking specializations whose center of gravity shifted toward hilltop oppida work towns that could make, store, judge, and trade. Start at the scale of the house. A typical farmstead consisted of timber buildings in a palisaded yard, a dwelling with a hearth and storage lofts, side sheds for tools and livestock, granaries raised on stilts to keep grain dry and rats baffled, pits for surplus sealed with care. Families were large by our standards, kin groups spanning several generations, and work divided by skill, not by contempt. Men felled, plowed, mended harness, cut ditches, fought, Women brewed, baked, spun, wove, cured hides, kept accounts in memory as crisp as any tally, and ran booths on market days. Children apprenticed by watching. A boy's hand learned the weight of the yard and the swing of a hammer. A girl's arm memorized the loom's cadence and the thickness of good yarn. Household honor was public. A clean yard, sound bins, steady bread and beer, and well-timed gifts at feasts said as much about a family as any boast. Above households stood aristocratic lineages, called them houses, because the word carries both timber and people. A house held land and clients, commanded a retinue of mounted fighters and young companions, and maintained a reputation for generosity. Its head was a broker. He fed, he rewarded, he lent seed and tools, he offered protection at fair and ford, he spoke at council and guaranteed oaths. In return, he expected labor at harvest and road work, arms when called, and loyalty in the thin years. Clientage was not mere subordination, it was a safety net and a ladder. A bold youth could enter a retinue, and, if he distinguished himself in war or negotiations, rise by gifts into land, marriage, and a place on the bench. Prestige moved downward as food and cloth, upward as service. Councils knit houses into tribes. Elders and chieftains met on appointed grounds, sometimes within an oppidum, sometimes at an old grove, sometimes by a spring whose water turned oaths into binding drink. There they debated with a stylized eloquence we glimpse through Greek and Roman ears, cutting speech, praise and blame, a memory for precedent, and a habit of building consensus with gifts and hostages. Hostages were not prisoners of hate, but living seals. Sons and nephews, lodged with allies, educated there, forming ties that made future cooperation cheaper. Matters of law-land boundaries, insult and injury, market fraud, marriage settlements were handled first within the tribe. Druids and bards could be called to arbitrate, not as priests above life, but as walking treasuries of remembered norms. Written codes were rare. The code was in people-trained memories and a calendar of hearings. Oppida changed the scale. A hilltop town was not only a fort, it was a work market. Crafts clustered in zones, iron smelting and smithing by the windward side, where smoke and sparks blew clean. Non-ferrous metalwork under better light. Potters near clay. Salt merchants under awnings. Tanners downstream. Weavers everywhere, because textiles were the quiet backbone of the economy. Iron arrived as blooms or bars. Smiths reheated and hammered, welded and normalized, turned out plowshares and coulters, knives and nails, spearheads and long blades, and the fittings without which a farm cannot function. Hinges, cramps, rings, clasps. Bronze and goldsmiths drew wire, twisted and soldered torcs and bracelets, stamped sheet into ornate terminals, cast brooches whose spring pins were feats of control. Glassworkers added inlays and beads. Bone and antler carvers made combs, pins, and small tools. The best work bore signatures, motifs, and techniques that marked a master or school as clearly as a hallmarked spoon. Textiles, usually unsung, filled stores. Women and specialist workshops spun wool and flax, wove plain cloth for everyday use, and finer fabrics for gift and sale. Cloth was currency, easy to divide, portable, universally useful, and a visible index of status when dyed and patterned. Alongside cloth came salt boiled at marshes and brine springs in ceramic pans, broken from porous cakes into blocks and shipped upriver. Salt let meat travel and survive surprise. It turned a coastal or inland spring into a regional hinge. Grain, too, was more than food. It was policy. With granaries on posts and well-sealed pits, a community could ride out a bad harvest, feed a garrison or work gang. and schedule feasts that made alliances real. Markets ran by rhythm. The fair day was known. Stalls stood by craft. Measures were recognized. Weights were tested on simple balances. Brokers put buyer to seller. Porters with yokes and carts hauled to landings. Boatmen took over on river. Dues were collected as stall fees or small skims off goods. The fairness of the skim mattered because trust held the system more than walls did. A chief's men kept order, separated brawlers, and called cases to the bench. Fines, grain, cloth, metal were levied at once. Wine made from southern amphorae flowed in volume by the 2nd century BCE. Amphora dumps in the interior tell of insatiable taste. But wine was not just a luxury, it was a lever. To pour well at a feast was a political act. Generosity made loyalty visible. Sobriety the morning after made it last. Coinage quietly rewired behavior. Early on, Greek misaliot and other imported issues set the pattern. Soon, oppida and tribal centers struck their own heads, and horses simplified into spirals and pellets, names compressed to initials, weights that could be counted with hands, not hunches. Coin did not kill barter. It stabilized dues, paid retinues between campaigns, eased long-distance exchange, and let a leader turn charisma into contracts. A pouch of small silver could turn a promise into a timetable. Law lived in the same places as trade. Market fraud, a false measure, watered salt, rotten grain painted clean, was dealt with harshly because it hurt everyone. Injury and insult were leveled with compensation, graded by status and circumstance. The point was not to erase pain, but to keep cycles of revenge from eating the calendar. Theft from granaries and store yards was close to sacrilege. Boundary stones mattered. Water rights mattered more. Oaths made at springs and groves were not quaint. They were enforceable because everyone heard them, and because breaking them cost the breaker place and partner. In crises, councils could vote for extreme measures, banishment, demolition, ritual humiliation. Yet the default was restoration. Pay, serve, host, repair. War and economy were not strangers. Retinues ate. Forts consumed labor and timber. Campaigns tore men from plows and forges. Spoils, cattle, metal, cloth were redistributed under many eyes. Feast and gift converted violence into order. A good leader made sure the same hands were not always empty after the same work. A bad won, greedy, unfair in the divide, careless with hostages, or unpredictable in mood, found his councils thin and his banners lonely at the next assembly. For that reason, many houses cultivated a second reputation beside bravery: steadiness. The man whose word held through a lean year was the man whose call was worth heeding in a dangerous one. Not everyone stood equal under the law's shade. Dependents existed, debt bondsmen, captives turned into labor, families who placed a child in service to escape hunger. But even dependence had forms and exits. Redemption was possible. Abuse could be tried before elders. Human property was more often a household tie than a chattel market. Slavery, in the sense Romans knew it did appear in the trade, outward. Captives taken in war left Gaul in chains. But inside, social glue and scarcity of labor made permanent dehumanization bad business. The gray zone was wide. A retainer proud of his torcs and a servant proud of his steady place might sit near on a bench, distinguished not by a brand, but by who spoke first. Women were not invisible in any of this. They kept workshops humming. Their cloth-clothed retinues and filled dues. They ran stands on fair day and argued cases with the best of them. Their kin ties glued houses together. Their laments and songs were part of law's memory. Their hands ran midwifery and healing as practical arts, not the hush of mystery. When treaties sealed with marriage, the bride was not a token. She was a corridor news, and norms flowed with her, converting alliance from parchment to habit. The oppidum, as a social machine, needed inspectors as much as warriors. Someone checked storeyard seals. Someone counted amphorae and jars. Someone set the repair rota for walls and gates. Someone monitored the slope where rain cut ruts. Someone tallied who owed a day on the ditch and who had done it. The work calendar was heavy, but bearable because it repeated, after sowing, this, after harvest, that, before the winter fair, such and such. Repetition was security. A society that knows what its hands will do in March can afford to decide in June whether to fight in August. Finally, the moral economy, the unwritten budget of praise and blame. The greatest virtues were measure and generosity. Do not waste another's labor. Keep your word. Give visibly when you have. Share the drink and meat so that a poor man feels seen. Sit where you ought. Accept correction without sulk. Take pride, but not the kind that breaks feasts. Vices were the predictable enemies of cohabitation. Gluttony that empties bins. Drunkenness that ruins market hours. Vanity that buys a golden brooch with seed corns worth of silver. Lies that send a plow team to the wrong field. A leader's contempt for the old words that hold young men in line. These are homely things, but they are what made a hill of timber and stone into a place people wanted to defend. Seen this way, Gaul before Caesar is not a chorus of painted throats. It is a choreography of work. Iron and cloth, salt and grain, coin and oath, feast and fine, client and patron, bench and marketal, move together enough of the time to let large communities prosper, and to let some of them attempt scale. Walls measured in thousands of timber pegs, fairs counted in thousands of mouths, retinues that could ride farther than the horizon of a single parish. Only on such a base do the later scenes make sense. Sacred groves with their penalties and pardons, mail shirts that speak of surplus, chariots and carts on roads that someone must maintain, sudden coalitions that come from long, slow habits of exchange. We turn to religion next, not to flee economics, but to finish the picture of how norms traveled, why oaths stuck, and how memory held when writing did not so, that law, feast, and field stayed in step until an outside drumline forced a change. 4. Religion and the Druids, sacred groves, and the grammar of order. If the oppidum was Gaul's muscle, religion was its nervous system, threads of rite and memory that coordinated hands far apart in space and time. The sacred places were not marble precincts. They were groves and springs, timber-fenced enclosures on knolls, wetlands where offerings sank into silt, and crossroads where treaties were spoken aloud. The gods were many, and local river guardians and spring healers, hilltop lords and thunder-bearers, protectors of oaths and boundaries. Yet beneath this variety lay a common grammar. It paired season to season, feast to redistribution, oath to witness, victory to restraint, and, when needed, blood to debt. To read that grammar is to see how law and economy kept their footing. Begin with place. A sacred grove. Nemeton was defined less by walls than by behavior. No cutting without license, no lies under the boughs, no violence within the bounds unless ritually declared. Springs drew people for cures and covenants, offerings of metal and wood, cloth and food, coins and figurines were thrown or buried as ties with the unseen. Timber enclosures, rectangles, or rings collected the community's vows. Pits filled with broken weapons, bent to make them safe for the gods. Bones of sacrificial animals. Ceramics with food remnants from ritual feasts. Posts stained by generations of processions brushing past. Some sanctuaries sat under the wing of an oppidum, Others kept to older, liminal places, forest edges, river islands, barrow fields. The geography made sense. Oath and judgment needed both visibility and quiet, both proximity to power and a hint of old depth to discourage flippancy. Now the people who carried the law on their tongues, Druids, bards, and ovates. The labels blur, but functions can be sketched. Druids were the memory keepers and arbiters. They trained for years. Decade-long apprenticeships under masters, learning law, genealogy, diplomacy, cosmology, and the calendar. Their taboo against writing doctrine down was not a fetish against letters. It was a policy. Knowledge that lives in trained minds is harder to steal, twist, or counterfeit than knowledge that sits on a tablet. Bards were the tuners of speech. They kept lineage songs, praised the generous, lampooned the oathbreaker, and taught youth through verse that sticks in the mouth. Ovats tended ritual specialties, augury, healing, the reading of signs in nature. Together they gave society a portable court. A council could sit wherever these people stood, because the law walked with them. Ritual calendars wove this expertise into the year, feasts linked to sowing and harvest, to solstices and equinoxes, to local founder myths and league oaths. The pattern was practical. Before plowing, come distribution of seed and tools. After harvest, grain dues and the great communal meal. In winter, treaties renewed, hostages affirmed, punishments softened or confirmed. Not every feast spilled blood. Most didn't. Animal sacrifice cattle, pigs, sheep fed people and honored gods. When ancient writers speak of human sacrifice, we are reading a contested edge. There were hard rites, the hanging, the burning, the drowning, especially in crisis, and at sanctuaries, where the logic was, pay and what you fear to lose to keep catastrophe at bay. Weapons bent, and skulls displayed, as trophies spoke another language. The warriors vowed to curb rage by placing its fruit under the god's eye. However sharp the scene, it sat inside a program whose main acts were feasting, oath-taking, compensation, and restraint. Oath was the hinge. An oath in Gaul was not a mutter in the dark. It was performed recited before elders and druids, tasted in a ritual drink, sealed by gifts and hostages, bound to a day in the calendar. The hostage was not only collateral, he was a student and a messenger. Raised in an ally's house, he learned their speech and custom. When alliances shifted, he became a bilingual broker whose face could diffuse a fight at a ford faster than a spear line could settle it. Break an oath, and the penalty was public. Fines in grain and cloth, loss of place at feasts and markets, withdrawal of protection, sometimes expulsion. The point was not only to punish, it was to set costs so that even a volatile noble could calculate the price of going hot. Sanctuaries ordered violence. Before campaign season, retinues paraded through sacred space to receive blessing and warning. Vows were taken to spare fields and granaries of oathkeepers. Pillage against neutrals brought fines later. Captives could be devoted to the gods yet spared if their ransom paid the vow's value with interest. Trophy display shields, swords, sometimes heads, was heavily ritualized. The taking of a head, so often singled out by ancient writers, was less a casual cruelty than a legal claim. This blow was struck under rules, with witnesses. Even here, right aimed to discipline force, not just sanctify it. Healing and protection belong to the same economy. Springs with votive limbs in bronze or stone feet. Hands, eyes, show petitioners asking for cures and thanking for them. Amulets and inscribed offerings, in the Roman period, show continuity. As Latin letters enter, the old habit of naming gifts persists. Women appear everywhere in this record. dedicants, vow makers, leaders of processions, keepers of the household shrine. They managed family memory, the births, marriages, reconciliations, and debts that law must remember to be law, not mere threat. Druidic arbitration deserves a clear scene. Imagine two houses disputing a boundary and water access. Rather than draw swords at once, they summon a panel of druids and elders to a grove or enclosure. Each side states claims, witnesses speak to use and precedent. Bards recite lines remembered from earlier judgments. The druids retire, discuss, and return with settlement. Stones to be moved, ditch to be cut. Compensation so many cattle or so much cloth. A feast to seal the peace, and reciprocal hostages for a year. The settlement is recited, memorized, and hung on a day in the ritual calendar so that future disputes can find it. No parchment is signed, yet the decision has teeth because everyone has a share in remembering it and a role in shaming the breaker. Religion also policed measure. Markets stood under divine attention. Cheating a measure was an offense before gods as much as neighbors. A chief who tolerated fraud risked not only unrest, but ritual pollution. No small matter when his prestige depended on presiding at feasts. Hence, inspectors and balances stood near shrines. Hence, fines could be framed as atonement, not simply taxation. In a world where writing travels slowly, sanctity makes administration portable. Cosmology, how the world hangs together, survived into the Roman period under Gaulish and hybrid names. High gods mapped onto Roman ones, thunder powers paired with Jupiter, healing springs with Apollo, warlords with Mars. Yet the local did not vanish. A river still had its guardian, a hill its lord, a market its patron. What changed was the interface. Dedications carved in Latin on stone, where once offerings were buried in pits, temples with columns, where once palisades stood, priesthoods with civic titles beside the Druids' older roles. The grammar held oath, feast, compensation, restraint, and season. It helps to see how religion and economy met in one act, the feast. A feast redistributed dues as generosity. It displayed craft, fine cups, patterned cloth, gleaming torcs. It confirmed hierarchy by seating and speech. It taught youth by song. It paid gods with prayer and portion. It knit households and allies by shared meat and drink. A society that feasts well conserves trust. People see the surplus and the fairness in its division. That is why Roman writers, even when hostile, could not stop describing Gaulish banquets. They sensed that these meals were not excess, but governance. We should be honest about the hard edge. Some sanctuaries show deposits that speak of violence turned sacred in ways we find painful. Human remains arranged with care, weapon pits salted with skulls. To deny these would be to dodge part of the record. Yet fixating on them alone would miss how rarely such acts occurred and how tightly they were bound by time, place, and speech. The everyday religion of Gaul was workaday. A coin flicked into a spring before a journey, a calf offered at a peacemaking, a vow to a grove for a child's recovery, a public apology recited with a fine paid-in cloth. The exceptional rites matter most when the ordinary fails. Drought, plague, invasion, moments when all societies strain for leverage over fate. Finally, religion's political power lay not in terror, but in translation. The same druid who taught boys by winter's long recitation could translate between feuding houses. The same bard who praised a generous chief could, with a cutting stanza, make stinginess shameful. The same ovate who read a bird's flight could fix a departure hour all accepted, saving a day of argument and risk. In fragmented polities, Such translators keep the mesh from tearing, which is why, when Rome pressed in, it sought first to win over, regulate, or remove these people. Cut the cords of memory, and leagues slacken. Leave them, and the leagues may stiffen faster than a governor likes. With this grammar of groves and oaths in mind, war looks different in the next part. The charge and the ambush sit inside a structure of vows, trophies, fines, and feasts. The Murus Gallicus protects a sanctuary as much as stores. The Druid's speech and the captain's signal aim at the same target common timing. And when Rome comes with engineers, Latin inscriptions, and a rival sacred politics, the imperial cult Gaul does not surrender its grammar. It translates it, keeping the functions even as the forms change. V were the Gaulish way, from onrush to tactics. Picture a slope under oak and beech, mist lifting as lines of oval shields tilt and lock, a rumble of carts along the flank, horn notes, curved bronze and straight bone trading calls with drums, riders wheeling out in bright cloaks, chiefs wearing heavy torcs and mail that rustles like rain. Roman writers like to fix the scene at the moment of impact. Hair flying, blades high, a wave of courage breaking against a wall of discipline. That moment existed. But the Gaulish art of war was more than a single charge. It was a grammar of movement and morale, of engineering and signals, of alliances that had to be held together by oath as well as by fear. To understand how Gaul fought and why it could both terrify and falter, we need to walk from forge to mustering ground, from rampart to ford, and from a chief's council to the smoky edge of a night camp. Begin with the kit, because tools shape habits. The long lateen sword lithe, springy, edged for the cut, was balanced to a human arm trained for reach and recovery. It liked room, a half-step of space, a twist of the hips, an oblique blow that bit through cloth and skin, smashed at joints, or battered a shield rim before a close-in wrestle. Scabbards with metal throats and chaps protected the blade and sped the draw. Suspension systems let a warrior carry this long tool without tripping in the press. Alongside it lived the spear and javelin, the first for the handshake distance where a shield's boss can thump as hard as a blade, the second for the first exchange, when a rank tries to rattle another's nerve before shield edges kiss. Shields were big and oval, wood with leather, and sometimes a bronze or iron boss. They were furniture and fortress both, able to be braced into a fence or tilted for roof work against darts. Mail interlinked iron rings shows up early in Gaul and becomes the elite skin. It is not a full solution to the spear's point, but it turns fatal blows into wounds one can walk away with, and that matters in societies where prestige is a long game. Horses and wheels gave Gaul speed. Cavalry light, darting, good at scouting, pursuing, and harrying. Served as the eyes and whip hand of an infantry column, catching an enemy in the moment between surprise and formation, or shadowing him until ground favored the strike. In some regions, especially in Armorica and across the Channel, chariots or fighting carts still rattled into battle-mobile platforms for bravado, missile play, quick entries and exits. They were stage and shuttle both. A warrior could leap down to fight on foot, then be whisked off if pinned. Romans, practical as ever, called this theater. It was theater with tactical uses. It kept enemy fronts guessing. It pierced the dullness of long stares across wet grass, and it fed a warrior ethos that wanted witnesses to courage. Sound and color carried command. Horns cut the air where speech died. Drum and rattle set pace. Standards bores, horses, coils and beasts in metal and textile marked leaders and rallied flyers. Painted bodies were not fairy paint. They made men visible at the long throw, bound cohorts to their house signs, and stiffened nerves where discipline had to be borrowed from pride. Chiefs wore mail, crested helmets, gilded brooches, patterned cloaks. They were lighthouses in chaos, and for that reason, prime targets. A warrior's retinue clustered around that visible center. If it held, the line could absorb shocks and return them. If it went down badly unavenged, unrelieved courage could turn to hurry in a breath. Engineering turned courage into time. The Murus Gallicus timber-laced rampart with a stone face was not picturesque masonry. It was physics. A timber lattice pegged into the hill, back-filled and faced, ate the force of rams, and shrugged at fire better than pure brush or dry stone. The long iron spikes that pinned it were an investment measured in thousands of hammer blows. Ditches before it made angles that multiplied effort. A man under the wall tires before he swings. A man above him recovers faster. Gates were choke points, sometimes with killing corridors and dog legs that forced a twist in the attacking column. Fieldworks felled trees, pits, wicker fences. Stone throws turned woods into knives and meadows into rugs that snagged a marching enemy's feet. If a tribe had time to think, it did not meet a foe on a billiard table. It chose folds and thorns. So why the famous onrush? Because shock works on the right ground, with the right heart. A massed charge of men who believe in one another and in the man at their center can buckle a tidy line if it hits before that line has rooted. The spearhand knows when the enemy's eyes drop and his shield sags, and one push at that instant brings the sweep. Gauls were good at finding that instant. It was trained. In retinues, where young men learned to stay close, to read their leader's shoulders, to catch and return the rhythm of drum and horn. In winter, drills where shields locked and unlocked, ranks opened and closed. The onrush was not a blind run, and its aim was not always killing. Often it sought a fracture, a hole where swords could work and captives could be taken for honor and ransom. Ambush was the other half. Gaul is crossed by streams and stitched with fords. It is edged with hedges and woods. A force that knows these traps can turn a marching army into a series of isolated knots: vanguard, main body, baggage, rear each hit in a different way. Cavalry pulls the head, skirmishers sting the flanks, a fallen tree or a fired cart freezes the middle, and a proper fight blooms where an enemy tries to clear the mess with too few hands. The goal is not always a decisive battle. Often it is to waste time, to let rain and hungry ground do some of the killing, to draw a confident foe deeper until his supply creaks and his allies look elsewhere for safety. Supply was the secret battle. Gaul's armies ate from granaries and carts, and from the goodwill, or fear, of their own hinterlands. A chief's capacity to feed mouths for a fortnight could decide whether his coalition showed up. Here the Roman style hurt Gaul. Roads that held wagons in weather, pack animals in long trains, exact tallies, officers whose business was to think only of bread and nails. Gauls knew how to feed themselves on the move portable grain, dried meat, salt, but their coalitions had to recompute supply whenever a house switched sides or a market shut in fear. A leader who planned set depots, guarded fords, rotated the same men out to harvest, promised and kept, could keep a drumbeat going. A leader who burned bridges with swagger found that courage cannot be eaten. Command ran on speech. Councils on the eve of a campaign were not mere ceremony. They were contract. Who leads first? Whose banner stands where? Who holds the gate if the fight runs back? What share of spoils and glory is owed to whom? What to do if a cousin fails? Oaths, spoken over drink, under groves, before standards turned this into law. The weak point is obvious. Charisma can convene, but it cannot standardize. Each tribe brought its own habits, each retinue its own favorites. That looseness made Gaul agile and brave. It made Gaul poor at the second day, when a coordination problem returns after the poetry has faded. Siegecraft sort of split the difference. Gauls could build, they could defend, and they could assault in style ladders, fires, rams, thrown stone, sudden rushes under shields, mining when rock allowed. They could also starve an enemy by cutting him off from water and field. What they generally did not have before facing Rome were machines in depth torsion engines, standardized rams, a trained cadre of sappers with a single doctrine. They compensated with nerve and numbers. Sometimes it worked, sometimes a stout gate and a calm commander made it grind. Against Roman earthworks, the twin belts of circumvallation and contravallation around a hill like Alesia, the Gaulish answer had to be speed and relief armies. When those armies worked to the same beat, they dented even Roman belts. When they fought by turn and pride, the belts held and the hill ran out of food. At sea, Gauls were uneven. The Veneti of Armorica had heavy, high-sided vessels built for tides and shoals, good against ramming, dangerous with ropes and grapnels in skilled hands. They could make the sea a wall and a trap. Inland, river flotillas mattered. Rafts, ferries, and boats that ferried infantry past, bends and sloughs, faster than a leg on muddy track. Control of crossings was a constant campaign. Build a bridge, smash a bridge, stake a ford, throw a temporary span, and set men over at night. The tribe that held water gates could refuse battle and still win a month. The ethos of war mattered as much as metal. Glory came in the form of commendation and song, visible seats at feasts, better cloth, gifts from a chief's hand, and above all, captives taken with one's own courage. A brave man was expected to be generous fating companions, paying fines for a client's foolishness, ransoming responsibly. A greedy brave man was despised. Heads taken in battle. An ugly fact in Greek and Roman pages were proof of prowess and a claim to reward. Fixed in sanctuaries, they were also a social reminder that valor has rules and witnesses. Druids and elders tried to discipline this ethic, praise the man who held a line, not just the man who burst it. Shame the looter who made the whole tribe pay with a burned field and a lost market. Demand reparations after a hot victory that scorched too much. Women threaded the war fabric. They provisioned. They made and mended mail and textiles. They kept counts that chiefs later recited, as though born in their mouths. They carried intelligence between allied houses that men could not reach without insult. Their laments and praise shaped reputations with a permanence a single victory could not. In sieges, they hauled water, slung stones, and carried boys to safety. In councils, their kin ties cooled rash men and sank deals whose hidden costs they had measured better than the talkers. Intelligence ran on people. The Pachtica-like role in Gaul fell to merchants, travelers, and those same hostages whose childhoods in foreign houses taught them accents and alleyways. A chieftain who listened to such mouths knew where grain was dear, where a ford had shoaled, which elder had quarreled with which cousin, and how far an enemy column could march before its belly howled. A chieftain who deprecated such soft things as womanish or low emptied his granaries into songs and found the next month less tuneful. Set Gaul beside Rome, and the contrasts sharpen. Romans turned war into an algorithm march: camp, dig, measure, march. Their legion was a box of tools: cohort, maniple, pilum, spade, stake, horn, code word. Gauls turned war into an ensemble house: retinue, horn, horse, pledge, rush, rampart. The ensemble was flexible, inspiring, quick to see and cease. It struggled against a foe who refused to be provoked, who could be hurt but not flustered, who had reserve days of food and reserve bridges of timber and plan. When Gaul learned to imitate parts of that toolkit, when a leader like Vercingetorix burned crops to starve invaders, chose ground, enforced discipline, coordinated relief, the ensemble stiffened into something new and impressive. And still, the old problem lurked, keeping many proud centers on one timetable for long. Finally, the quiet virtues that win campaigns when courage is matched. Repair beats genius, a gate mended at dusk, a ditch recut after rain, a pledge renewed before envy blooms, a ration fairly weighed under the shrine's eye. Measure beats mood, reinforcements sent before the drums fail, scouts gone before a crossing, a feast set after a hard march to pay the body and the bond. Translation beats bluster, a druid's words cooling an angry bench, a marriage tie turning a must fight into a delayed fight, a market reopened because a chief could count. Today's grain is worth more than yesterday's grudge. Gaul's warfare, seen whole, is not an argument for savagery or for lost nobility. It is a system tuned to a landscape of woods and water, to a politics of many councils, to an economy of fairs and granaries, and to an ethic that prized visible courage and remembered generosity. Its strengths, shock, engineering on hills, deep local knowledge, speed of gathering, made it formidable. Its weaknesses, fragmentation, fragile supply at coalition scale, thin siege doctrine, pride that did not always bend to plan, made it vulnerable to a neighbor who specialized in turning time and shovel work into victory. Knowing this, we can follow the next chapters. Rome's century of contact, then Caesar's methodical war, with fewer illusions and a better sense of what was lost, what was translated, and what, in certain valleys and under certain oaks, never quite stopped beating. Sixth, Rome and Gaul before Caesar. A century of contact. When Julius Caesar crossed into Transalpine Gaul in 58 BCE, he did not step onto a blank slate. For a century and more, the Mediterranean had been seeping into Gaul by calmer means. Wine up the rivers, mercenaries down to foreign wars, Greek measures, and Italic amphorae traded for salt, hides, metals, and people. Roads and way stations crept outward from Rome's first foothold beyond the Alps. Massalia, Marseille, translated between coastal merchants and inland councils. Alliances were inked not on paper, but in shared campaigns, gifts, and legal fictions like friend and ally of the Roman people. By the time Caesar wrote his commentaries, the map of loyalties and grudges in Gaul already bore Roman fingerprints. Roman memory, never shy of drama, liked to begin earlier with the shock that stamped a proverb on the city's soul. The Alesia and the sack of Rome by a Gallic host under a leader remembered as Brennus, traditionally 390-387 BCE. The details are fogged by legend. The moral the Romans drew was clear. Beware the peoples from the north who move fast, fight hard, and do not fear walls. For our purposes, the episode matters less as fact than as mythic frame. It made Gaul a category of anxiety that Roman statesmen could invoke whenever policy needed urgency. Across the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, Latin peoples pressed through the Alpine corridors into the Po Plain, which Roman writers came to call Cisalpine Gaul. There, Gaulish centers in Subris, Boii, Senones coexisted and competed with Etruscan and Italic towns. Their material culture shows the blend: timber and stone ramparts, long swords and oval shields, Italic bronzes in elite graves, coinage that starts by copying Greek types and then swirls into confident spirals. These North Italian Gauls fought Rome and sometimes hired on with it. They were neighbors, not abstractions. Rome's long, patient wars of the 3rd–2nd centuries, BCE, against the Boii, against the Insubres, taught the Republic the habits it would later use in Transalpine Gaul. Cut roads, plant colonies, keep a ledger of friends and enemies, and let victory be a slow accretion rather than a single hammer blow. Meanwhile, on the Mediterranean lip of Gaul, Massalia, a Greek foundation, was a relay of goods and habits. From its harbors, wine flowed inland in ranks of amphorae. Back downriver came salt, metal, grain, wool, and the most tragic export of all, slaves. Massalia also spread measures, weights, and contractual finesse. It hired Gaulish men as ship guards and caravan escorts. It stood at councils as a polite voice for Roman interests before Rome had a formal province. The Rhone-Saône ladder carried amphorae astonishing distances, dumps of smashed Italian dressel. 1 wine jars at inland oppida speak of a taste that reshaped elite politics. Wine was a social machine. To pour well at feasts was to knit clients and rivals to your bench. To control the river runs and market days that fed those feasts was to govern without writing a law. Rome's first hard stake beyond the Alps was Provincia later Gallia Narbonensis, cut into the coastal strip and lower Rhone Valley in the 120s BCE. 2 Roman victories stand as cornerstones: the defeat of the Allobroge and their Arvernian overlord Bituitus, 121 BCE, under Genornaut Domitius Ahenobarbus and Q. Fabius Maximus, and the founding shortly after of Narbo Martius, 118 BCE, a Roman colony that anchored road, tax, and garrison in one place. A great military road, the Via Domitia, tied the province to Italy stones and milestones, following older tracks that Gauls and Greeks had worn smooth with trade. With roads came way stations, custom points, market calendars regularized under Roman eyes, and a steady stream of Italian merchants who spoke contracts as a native tongue. This coastal presence did not conquer Transalpine Gaul. It leveraged it. Provinces just beyond the Roman line began to calculate differently. Elite houses asked themselves whether friendship with Rome could be turned into advantage against rivals. The Aedui, a powerful bloc on the Saône, secured the title Friends and Allies of the Roman People. It offered prestige and, occasionally, Roman help against enemies, especially against the Sequani, their neighbors and rivals. The Sequani, in turn, sought counterweights not in Rome, but among Germanic powers across the Rhine. Here enters a new actor, migrating and marauding groups like the Cimbri and Teutones, who roiled the politics of both Gaul and Italy in the late 2nd century BCE. The Cimbrian Teutonic crisis, 113–101 BCE, was a continental shudder. Great mobile communities rolled along the edges of Gaul and into it, broke Roman armies, and finally were stopped by Marius at Aquae Sextiae, 102, and Vercellae, 1091. For Gaul, the lesson was doubled. Rome could lose badly, so aligning with it wasn't an instant shield, and Rome, when reformed and properly led, could annihilate a moving nation, so aligning against it might be fatal. In between these poles, pragmatic tribes learned to hedge, send gifts to Narbo, trade with Massalia, keep a cousin betrothed to a neighbor across the river, and never let one alliance close all the others. Trade thickened the hedge. It was not only wine, black slip tableware, bronze pans, glass, olive oil, and fish sauce trickled and then poured into markets along the Loire, Seine, and Moselle. In response, Gaulish coinage proliferated. The face and horse types spun into abstraction, but their weights and circulation show an economy increasingly comfortable with counted value. Amphorae brought more than drink. They brought a rhythm delivery windows, storage habits, credit and debt cycles, that tethered inland fares to coastal harbors. Roman merchants, making money twice, on the import and on the export of captives and raw materials, learned Gaulish names. Gaulish elites learned Roman enmities. The Rhine frontier added new stresses in the first half of the 1st century BCE. Germanic war bands under leaders like Ariovistus crossed into the upper Rhine basin, invited by some Gauls, notably the Sequani, as counterweights to Aeduan power. What arrived were not temporary swords, but settlers and clients who demanded land and tribute, altered roots, and sat at councils as if native. Gaulish politics, already a braid of ancient rivalries, now had a new thread that scratched. Romans warning of barbarians becoming permanent. Gauls, who liked neither neighbor, now playing both ends against the middle. In this thicket of half-promises, hostages and oaths multiplied, and the cost of keeping them did too. Inside Gaul, hegemons rose and fell. The Arverni in central Gaul had once dominated leagues. Their prestige survived long after Bituitus's parade chariot vanished into Roman custody. The Aedui called themselves Rome's friends, and sometimes received Roman help, or claimed they had. The Sequani took Ariovistus's bargain and then regretted the bill. The Remi to the northeast cultivated a quieter reputation for reliability and fair markets, a trait that would matter greatly once a Roman proconsul needed local partners he could trust. On the Atlantic, Armorican port polities like the Veneti husbanded their seaborne independence and their serious ships. Thick, high-sided, built for tides and weather, rather than for the crush and ram games of the Mediterranean. All the while, Rome refined its soft tools. Diplomats and equities merchants mapped who hated whom. Governors in Narbonensis issued arbitrations that, though technically limited to the province, carried weight up the rivers. Auxiliary levies recruited Gauls, especially Cisalpines, into Roman campaigns, teaching them the legionary tempo and introducing them to pay, donatives, and the Roman ladder of honors. Road crews and bridge gangs pushed infrastructure northward, where politics allowed. A people used to sacred markets and oath-guarded fairs now also had calendarized assizes and tax days within reach. Nothing here abolished Gaulish custom. Much here translated it into transactions legible to a Roman magistrate. The result by 60-58 BCE was a precarious equilibrium. Many Gaulish communities were entangled with Rome economically and diplomatically. Some were angered by the overreach of Germanic kings. Others were tempted to flip old rivalries with new patrons. Almost all had tasted the benefits of far trade and the dangers of being cut off from it. This was not a world aching to be conquered. It was a world busy with its own problems, into which a skillful commander could insert himself by offering speed, arbitration, and security. The three goods Gaul's mosaic of councils had trouble producing at scale. Caesar understood the opening. He would present himself as the protector of allies, the Aedui, the expeller of Germanic intruders, Ariovistus, the guarantor of free river routes, the arbiter in disputes others had inflamed, and the engineer who could bring order where timber and oath were no longer enough. He inherited more than a map. He inherited a vocabulary Gauls and Romans already shared. Friendship, hostage, client, road, market, tribute, each with slightly different meanings, each capable of being tuned to his advantage. When the Helvetii set out to migrate and sent embassies politely requesting passage, they put their request into this shared language. When Caesar refused and moved, he did it in the same language, just louder. To read the conquest well, then, we must carry this century of contact in our heads. Massalia's wine ships and Narbo's milestones, Aeduan pride and Sequanian bargains, Remian reserve, Armorican seamanship, Arvernian old glory, Germanic pressure at the Rhine, coin in leather pouches, amphorae stacked in inland courtyards, councils that could decide much and yet not end anything. Rome before Caesar was not a distant thunder. It was a neighbor whose shadow already fell on fairs and oathstones. Caesar did not invent the Roman presence in Gaul. He weaponized it, turning trade routes into lines of march, long-standing friendships into marching orders, and a patchwork of local crises into a single theater he could dominate. Only against that backdrop will Vercingetorix's counter-program and the siege belts at Alesia look like what they were: the last brilliant attempt to solve Gaul's coordination problem faster than Rome could solve Gaul itself. 7. Caesar's conquest: war, engineering, resistance. When Julius Caesar stepped into Transalpine Gaul as proconsul in 58 BCE, he brought 3 advantages that Gaul's councils could rarely assemble at once: speed, arbitration, and security, backed by a machine that turned spadework into fate. He also brought a story he would write as he went, the Commentari de Bello Gallico, which fixed names and scenes for 2 millennia. To read the conquest fairly, we have to set Caesar's narrative against the ground we've walked: oppida and oathstones, wine routes and hostage ladders, the Murus Gallicus and the feast as redistribution. What follows is less a blur of victories than a sequence of decisions, by Gauls and by Romans, that bound the mosaic into a single theater and then squeezed it until coalitions cracked. The opening move came from migration. The Helvetia, pressed by neighbors and their own calculus, decided to abandon their Alpine foreland as a body and resettle in western Gaul. They asked permission to pass through the Roman province. Caesar refused, burned their bridges in both senses, and met them first at the Son, catching a segment of their column mid-crossing and punishing it before the rest could dress ranks. Then he shadowed the migrating mass and army with wagons, harrying, counting days, forcing a turn until a set-piece fight near Bibracte broke their will. The Helvetii went back the way they had come, by Roman order. On the surface, this looked like a police action. In practice, it announced a doctrine. Corridors would be held. Large movements would be decided by the man with the legions. Next, Caesar recast a neighbor's request for help as a mandate to redraw the map. The Aedui, long Rome's friends, were losing their grip on the Sequani Ariovistus problem. Ariovistus, a Germanic king invited across the Rhine to counter Aeduan power, had taken land, taken tribute, and taken a seat at Gaulish councils as if native. Caesar marched north, talked hard, and when talk failed, fought. In a campaign of marches and sudden camps, he forced Ariovistus back across the Rhine. The result was not simply Germans expelled, it was the erasure of a precedent. No external strongman would be allowed to sit in Gaulish politics without Roman leave. The commentaries make Ariovistus a foil. More important is that Caesar made himself arbiter at scale. With the Belgic confederations in the northeast, Caesar met a different problem. Many proud centers with short-term coalitions. He answered with what he did best: fragmentation by speed. He moved quickly, struck where a league was still dressing itself, accepted surrenders that stripped coalitions of their sensible members, and punished the obstinate with methodical sieges. At Axona and Sabis, disciplined campcraft and reserves won days that Gaulish rushes could not quite seize. The Remi, who had cultivated reputations for fair dealing and reliable markets, became Caesar's anchor among the Belgae. He paid them with trust and rank. This was conquest by ledger as much as by spear. Fix allies in place with hostages and titles, bill enemies in blood, and leave winter quarters where a Roman garrison's market and court rewrote local rhythms. On the Atlantic, Divinity posed a challenge Caesar's manuals did not cover. High-sided tidal ships with tough leather rigging, built for channels and shoals, able to laugh off rams and pull away from Mediterranean galleys. Caesar answered with engineering and local brains. He built a fleet with reinforced prows and a new weapon-long poles, with hooks and sickles, to cut rigging and drop the Veneti's great sails. Once the sails came down, heavy hulls were dead in the water. The battle was brutal and exemplary. The lesson spread. Roman power could translate itself onto unfamiliar media. Water, forest, marsh, fast enough to make "we've never seen this before" a poor defense. He dramatized flexibility again at the Rhine. Twice he threw bridges across the river with theatrical speed, marched a symbolic distance into Germanic territory, then withdrew. Military necessity was arguable. Political necessity was obvious. The river would not be a line of Roman timidity. The bridges were speeches in timber. Gauls' councils learned that "over there" was now within Roman stride. Caesar twice also sailed to Britain, a place of rumor and trade partners, where some Gallic leaders looked for refuge and help. The expeditions were reconnaissance in force, not conquests. They proved two things. Caesar could project fear beyond the Channel, and the Armorican British circuits could not be relied upon to shelter anti-Roman coalitions without risk. Through these marching years, Caesar's supply arithmetic tells as much as his battle prose. He made roads where there were tracks. He built depots where there were markets. He pulled grain levies from friends and forage from enemies. He seeded bridges and causeways across rivers and marsh. The spade served the pen. His troops arrived fed and drilled to the hour. His enemies had to choose between fighting hungry and dispersing to harvest under Roman eyes. Oppida that once ate sieges, forced on the Murus. Gallicus now found themselves cinched with belts of circumvallation and contravallation, dirt and timber-strangling hills that timber and stone had once protected. Inevitably, Gaul pushed back with a mind to match his. The Ambiorix incident, 54-53 BCE, is the dark hinge of Book 5. Winter-quartered legions, scattered at Caesar's own order to keep many civitates under gaze, became vulnerable. Ambiorix of the Iberones lured a Roman camp into a negotiated retreat and destroyed it in the open Sabinus and Cotta dead, men cut down in bog and thicket. Across the northeast, bands rose. Caesar's answer was winter concentration and reprisal, forced marches, ravaging, and deliberate attempts to erase the Eburones' very name by handing their lands over to plunder from neighbors. The message was clear. A broken pact with Rome would be answered beyond the measure of the original injury. It worked in the immediate sense. It also taught Gaul that only a general rising with discipline would ever unseat the machine. That rising had a leader, Vercingetorix of the Arverni, 52 BCE. His program was the most intelligent Gaul could field against Caesar's strengths. He insisted on coordination, a single timetable for many peoples, on discipline, no private raids to satisfy pride, on scorched earth, deny the legions forage and fodder, on fortress economy, defend only strong points and choose battleground, on politics, bring doubters in with pressure and promise. It was the anti-Caesar algorithm: destroy food, avoid pitched battle, force the Roman to stretch supply lines across hostile land, and make him bleed against timber and ditch. At Avaricum, a rich oppidum whose citizens begged exemption from the burnings, Vercingetorix's policy cracked under local pity and pride. Caesar besieged and took the city with grim thoroughness, then allowed a massacre that Roman readers have never been able to forget. The strategic cost to Gaul was larger than the life lost. Vercingetorix's doctrine hard, clear, necessary was shown to be politically fragile. At Gergovia, by contrast, Caesar tasted a check terrain, morale, and overreach cost him the advantage, and the Gauls' confidence briefly soared. Gergovia proved that good ground and coordination could blunt even Caesar. The war swung to its climax at Alesia, where Vercingetorix allowed himself to be enclosed on a hill that seemed invincible when seen through earlier centuries' eyes. Ramparts, people, stores, a strong leader, and relief armies gathering. Caesar built 2 walls, one to face in, circumvallation, and starve the hill, one to face out, contravallation, and keep off relief. Ditches, stakes, pits, towers, signals, water denied, cattle gone, sorties beaten back, a month's work pressed into days by an army drilled to march, dig, and fight without sagging. When the great relief force arrived, Caesar fought 2 battles at once, holding the inner wall, rushing reserves to breaches on the outer. Labyrinths and other legates won moments that instruments call tactical, but that, lived, are a set of held breaths. The relief broke, the hill starved, Vercingetorix surrendered. The image of him riding out to give up, whether embroidered or not, has stuck because it fits. An intelligent enemy, out-engineered and outlasted. After Alesia, the war did not cease, it unwound. There were fights. Uxellodunum fell after Caesar cut its water, a lesson as harsh as any. There were reconciliations and punishments, houses razed or spared, hostages taken and restored, tributes fixed. The skeleton of Roman administration civitates, councils compelled to sit under Roman oversight, road nets, winter quarters, levies hardened. What had been a mesh of routes and fares became a grid, the same geography, a new cadence. What made Caesar's method decisive? Not genius alone. He turned Gaul's problems inside out. Where coalitions were short-lived, he forced long campaigns and wintered in place. Where the economy depended on fair-day flows of food and cloth, he taxed time-digging belts that cost the enemy weeks he could not afford. Where prestige ran on public generosity, he outdistributed his rivals with pay, spoils, and the legal theater of amicitia friends and allies declared and ranked. Where courage sought the visible charge, he absorbed it with second lines and counterpunches, picked his ground, and made every victory pay in hostages and terms that rearranged councils. Equally, Gaul's resistance deserves clarity. It was not a flurry of rash barbarians against iron. It was a set of rational answers to the Roman algorithm. Vercingetorix's burnings hurt his own people because he measured the alternative and found it worse. The Veneti shipwrights built the right boats for their sea. The Belgae rightly tried to settle accounts with a winter-garrisoned enemy before spring fattened him. The Eburones chose guile because they lacked mass. Where Gaul failed was not in imagination or bravery. It was in the 3rd month of a hard plan. Keeping enough tribes on one calendar, under one rule of restraint, when pride, famine, and local urgencies gnawed the edges. Caesar wrote as he fought, plainly, with the reader's breath in his hand, and he left a map of memory. Names, rivers, deeds. But the transformation he began was carried forward by quieter instruments. Census and tribute regularized. Latin entered the market stall and council bench. Oppida learned to call themselves civitates and to send embassies in Latin formulae. Villas began to pin the countryside. Terra sigillata tableware from southern and central Gaul would later flow back along old routes to markets once called Gallic. That is the work of Part 8, for now a fair tally. The conquest rode on engineers, quartermasters, allies, especially the Remi, and other new friends, and on Caesar's political need back in Rome to produce results bold enough to drown his enemies in the forum. Against it stood a society that could field clever leaders and disciplined moments, but could not make order repeat fast enough at scale. The legions, with their habit of camp, trench, count, march, were a new season. They did not abolish Gaul's old grammar oath, feast, compensation, restraint, but they subordinated it. Where a council once set the hour and a Druid made the words that held it, a Roman tuba now blew. And yet, in the very roads the legions cut, and in the markets they secured, the life of Gaul persisted. Translated. 8. Roman Gaul and afterlives. From oppidum to city conquest did not end Gaul. It retuned it. The geography stayed rivers, passes, Atlantic weather, the long ladders of the Seine-Yonne-Saône-Rhône, and the Garonne to the Bay of Biscay. The workshops stayed iron and bronze, salt and cloth, though some moved and many learned new rhythms. Councils stayed, renamed, supervised, bound to new calendars. Even the sacred endured, translated into Latin stone and civic titles. What changed first was cadence, the Roman habit of count, pave, tax, recruit. The Roman insistence that what is decided once be repeatable. The hilltop oppidum did not vanish in smoke. It was coaxed down into gridded towns, tied to roads with milestones, and wired into a provincial system that asked for predictable grain, predictable oaths, predictable men. The new skeleton was administrative. Where a tribe once spoke as a league of houses, a civitas now stood a corporate body with a council, ordo, magistrates, tax rolls, and obligations. The civitas mapped imperfectly onto the old tribal territory, but often enough the names carried through. Aedui, Arverni, Remi, Santoni, Bituriges, Parisi. Voices from earlier parts now appearing on inscriptions and edicts. Above them stood the provincial capitals that anchored the grid. Lugdunum, Lion, where the Rhône meets the Saône. Narbo, Narbonne, in the south. Augustodunum, Autum, for the Aedui. Bertigala, Bordeaux, on the Garonne. Treveris Augusta Treverorum, Trier, toward the Moselle. These cities were not only political, they were funnels, and pumps markets, and courts, temples, and bath complexes, craft quarters, and river landings. The Roman city brought with it a kit of forms. A forum, a public square with basilica for business and law. A grid of streets with drains and paving where traffic demanded. Bathhouses that were, as much as hygiene, schools of civility. Theaters and amphitheaters that turned feast and spectacle from hilltop processions into seated, ticketed order. Aqueducts where springs permitted. Bridges that outlasted floods and made ferry rites a memory. None of this was Roman in the sense of imported stone blocks. Much of it was built by Gaulish hands with Gaulish timber and mortar, taught by itinerant engineers, and paid for by local councils under Roman pressure to look the part. A civitas that paved its forum and raised a temple to the emperor signaled not only loyalty, but competence. We can keep calendars and accounts. Law changed texture. Where oaths once hung on groves and springs, inscriptions now caught settlements in Latin letters. Where Druids held doctrine in memory, civic priests and flamens kept ritual books for the imperial cult and local syncretisms. Where fines were bins of grain and piles of cloth under elders' eyes, tax codes and assize days fixed payment and appeal. It did not erase the older habit of arbitration, it layered it. In the countryside, a boundary dispute still began with witnesses on the ground. In town, it ended with a magistrate's edict, and sometimes a carved boundary stone that no spring flood could wash from memory. Latin, once a trader's tongue in fairs, became the language of contract. It did not murder Gaulish speech. It slowly taught it to write, and then, in many districts, to yield. Economy, too, was re-engineered more by schedule than by invention. The road net old tracks straightened and hardened, new legs cut to avoid winter bogs. Let bulk goods move reliably. Grain levies went not only to nearby garrisons, but down to Mediterranean ports. Warehouses on river quays, standardized storage, weighing rooms and stamps regularized measures. Craft scaled up in patterned ways. Pottery kilns that had made sturdy household wares now joined organized districts, turning out terra sigillata, glossy red tableware whose stamps let archaeologists read distribution the way merchants once read invoices. Glass houses grew, smithies diversified into tool lines, bronze foundries kept old skills in new shapes, lampstands, fittings, faucets. In the countryside, the villa of farm headquarter, with a residence, barns, presses, and sometimes baths pinned estates to road and river, binding tenant plots and slave gangs to a house that kept accounts and reported taxes. Viticulture spread in belts where climate and market met. The amphorae that once came full of Italian wine now returned filled with Gallic wine. Barrels Gauls' gift to Roman logistics traveled with hoops and staves born of Gaulish forests and craft, easier to roll than jars, stronger under rough handling. Salt works kept boiling, fisheries provisioned garrisons and towns, cattle and horses bred for markets wider than any one tribe could command before. The Channel and Atlantic ports, Armorican heirs to Venetic seamanship, lived on as connectors to Britain, which, once conquered, became both market and source of troops and metals. The old corridors still mattered. They were now patrolled by curatores viarum and by the practical genius of road gangs. If one expects Romanization to be a steamroller, Gaul disappoints. If one expects it to be a polite handshake, Gaul also disappoints. It was a translation with loss and gain. Local gods learned Roman names, river lords under Neptune, healers under Apollo, thunderers under Jupiter, and received temples with columns in place of timber fences. Yet a traveler reading altars finds double names everywhere. Mars Camulus, Jupiter Poeninus, Mercury with epithet after epithet, the most popular of all, because in Gaul, as merchants long knew, a god of paths, trades, and words is everyone's patron. Sacred springs kept their therapy, vows kept their practical tone, for the child's recovery, for safe return, for victory, and households still tucked small offerings at thresholds and hearths. The imperial cult sacrifices and vows for the emperor and Rome did not erase local calendars. It added a public layer of loyalty that councils could perform together, useful for smoothing internal rivalries. The army both extracted and gave. It drew levies and volunteers. It taught the legionary tempo to men whose grandfathers had learned to fight in retinues. It returned veterans with money, Latin, and a taste for tiled roofs and hippocaust warmth. Gauls served first in auxiliaries, cavalry, archers, scouts, and, with citizenship granted, in legions. Units named for their homelands marched far and returned, never or late. Some settled abroad, seeding Gallo-Roman habits into provinces along the Rhine and Danube. Along the frontier, Cannabe civilian settlements by forts grew into towns with markets and altars, binding soldiers' families to local economies. In reverse, Roman officers married into local elites. Their sons sat on civitas councils, spoke both languages, and endowed baths that bore their names on lintels. Elite life rearranged itself with new ladders. A decurion in a civitas council could aspire to Roman equestrian rank. A generous banker of public works could earn statues and Latin honorifics. A priest of the imperial cult could chair festivals that blended old and new. Local aristocracies did not vanish. They learned to convert client bonds and feast largesse into civic sponsorship and Roman honors. Some lost footing families that refused to pay or to learn Latin formulas or to pledge sons to the new army. Others thrived, precisely because their gift-giving habits already mirrored the Roman expectation that a city's great men endow that city's stones. Not all was smooth. The same roads that brought prosperity brought exactions. The same census that regularized dues exposed households to seizure in bad years. The same peace that eased markets sometimes meant conscription far from home. Revolts flickered. Local, often short-lived, always expensive. Beyond the 1st century, in the 3rd and 5th, pressures from outside and within tore at the grid. Emperors rose in Gaul and fell in Italy. Germanic confederations learned to cross the Rhine without asking Roman permission. Taxes pinched, the army reshuffled. Yet much of what the Roman overlay had taught, the habit of fixed markets, of bridges repaired by calendar, of law written and posted proved resilient. Even as imperial power thinned, civitates knew how to convene. Fields knew when to sow. Merchants knew which bend with a gravel shelf to trust. Culture did not stop at drains and deeds. Latin grew a Gaulish flavor. Names lingered under new forms. Carving took the Latin curl and rephrased it on Roman stone. In poetry and prose, Gaulish-born writers Sidonius Apollinaris, later, among others, spoke a Latin that belonged to their cities and hills. In the 4th century, as Christianity spread, rural sanctuaries shifted into churches. Bishops assumed some of the Druids' old mediation roles, arbiters, memory keepers, voices who could quiet a riot and set a date. Springs and groves, long loved, kept their crowds under saints' names. The grammar we traced earlier, oath, feast, compensation, restraint. Season took new syntax and kept its function. Archaeology lets us watch this translation without rhetoric. In museum cases, sit torcs recovered from rivers where they were once vowed. Beside them, sigillata stamped with makers' names. In another room, a boundary stone with a Latin curse for anyone who moves it. In another, a model of a Murus Gallicus next to a Roman gate, with an inscription naming its donor. Aerial photos draw ghost lines of oppida under wheat. Road sections show the agars and ditches of imperial highways. Villa sites reveal presses and storerooms that speak the same language as the old granary on posts, just in a larger, stone-finished vocabulary. Walk the Rhone's banks, and you can still spot where barges tucked in. Stand in Lyons Theatre and hear a city relearning how to sit together to be spoken to. Memory after Rome rearranged the cast, but kept the stage. Medieval chronicles turned Vercingetorix into a mirror for princes and a foil for tyrants. Early modern antiquaries traced place names back to tribal ethnonyms. The 19th century made Gaul a national ancestor in need of honor. The 20th learned to temper legend with trench and trowel. In popular imagination, the Gaul became both cartoon and emblem-wild mustaches and wilder courage, and yet in schools and museums, the quieter truths gradually stood. That the Gauls' greatness lay as much in granaries, forges, and councils as in charges. That Roman Gaul was not a cemetery, but a workshop that turned old skills into new routines. That modern France's map still shows rivers and roads chosen when amphorae cracked and wheel hubs squealed. What, then, is the afterlife that matters beyond heritage politics? It is a set of competencies. How to tie hill to river and farm to fair. How to make repair a civic virtue. The gate mended before the rain. How to keep measure honest so markets do not rot. How to anchor law in memory and then in stone, so that a stranger can understand it. How to let local gods live under broader roofs without erasing them. How to turn a retinue into a council and a client list into a tax roll without breaking reciprocity. None of these are exotic. They are the bones of any lasting society. Gaul built them in wood and oath. Rome rebuilt them in stone and script. The provinces that followed inherited both. Stand, finally, on a ridge above a river bend in Burgundy, or Auvergne, or Champagne. Below you a town sits where a ford once was. A church marks a temple. A market squares a space where a council argued over grain and borders. A bridge's line repeats a Roman abutment that once replaced a ferry that once replaced a ford. Beyond, in the fields, a faint line curves where an oppidum's ditch ran. The wind carries wheat's hush and traffic's far tire song. Names have changed. Owners have changed. The rhythm make, count. Vow, feast. Repair has not. That is Roman Gaul's real afterlife, not a statue of Vercingetorix on a hill, eloquent though it is, but the ordinary competence by which a landscape keeps offering itself to human order, without quite forgetting the old grammar that first taught councils how to keep time.